Hi, thank you, Chris. Yeah, hopefully you can see my screen. Um, I'm Jessica Hodgson. I'm Senior Lecturer in Behavioural Science at Lincoln Medical School and also Senior Tutor, which is the sort of role where this information is coming from. So this is going to be a much less academic presentation. So that was really interesting to listen to Helen, and actually there's quite a lot of parallels with the observations you have about learning and people feeling sort of outside of the learning experience compared to their peers. And I think that those parallels are evident across a lot of healthcare programs as well. So what I'm going to talk to you about is our story, if you like, of how we've tried to do virtual student support in a couple of different ways, both before and after the pandemic. So I'm going to share some lessons with you and give you our experience. So just because I know not all of you were internal to Lincoln, but also for staff who don't know, the Lincoln Medical School was formed in 2018, and we had our first cohort in last September in 2019. And it's a partnership between the University of Nottingham and the University of Lincoln. So it's been one of these projects that's been in the planning for about 5 years. The General Medical Council finally released the funding, and it's all very exciting. The format is that the students are studying the University of Nottingham's medical degree, but it's delivered solely by staff and facilities at Lincoln. You can see on the background of this slide the new building, what it will look like. Currently, the sort of big monstrosity covered in scaffolding on the Brayford site. So now, as of this September, we have almost 200 undergraduate medical students. So we anticipated that because last year we knew we would have our first cohort entry, we anticipated that these students are not going to have the same experience of having senior near peers to get that sort of collegiate sense of support, that advice that's passed down from cohort to cohort. And before they arrived, myself and the other senior tutors at the University of Nottingham Medical School were very concerned that we have some sort of mechanism for our new students to support them. So this is our story before the pandemic. We knew that we needed peer support. We knew that's really important. We also knew that at the School of Medicine in Nottingham, they've had a very successful peer mentoring scheme that's gone on for many years. And that's usually where a third year student, maybe second year, supports the new first year. So if you don't know about a medical degree, it tends to be 5 or 6 years long. So we have students who get to be very old hands at being a student. So we took this model, which the traditional model, as I'm sure most of you know about peer mentoring schemes, involved matching a student with a few new incoming students and then encouraging them to relationship build, support academically and pastorally, but also just to encourage a sort of collegiate nature within their programme. So what we did was we adapted that to virtual peer mentoring. So now when I tell this story 12 months on, with everything we know now, after the lockdown and switching to virtual delivery in everything we do, it feels a little bit twee. What we did was we took the same model, the same structure of contact points, and we asked, so the peer mentors came from the University of Nottingham, and the mentees were our students here at Lincoln Medical School. And we asked the mentors to just get in touch with our mentees at the time points that they would normally do, check in with them, see how they're going. And predominantly it was centered around email. So you can probably already tell where this is going. So did it work? Well, I think this picture probably sums up quite a lot of, this is a student at Nottingham, but it's quite a lot of the sort of feeling from our mentees. What we found was the mentors, or actually nor the mentees either, didn't really branch out beyond the use of email. So they tended to stick to this bit sort of formulaic model of just dropping into someone's inbox just before an exam or just before a placement to see how they were. And they didn't really expand out into other forms of virtual communication, and neither, I have to say, did we as senior tutors push that. We found that the lack of interaction physically and the fact that they're on different sites, if you don't know the area, Lincoln and Nottingham is about 45 miles away. There's no shared site learning, so there's never any point in the curriculum where the students are together. And it takes about an hour or so on public transport to get between the sites. So this sort of lack of physical interaction seemed to actually hinder any kind of relationship building. And the feedback from the scheme, which we received about a week before lockdown, was that the mentees felt generally disconnected. And here's some of the feedback that you can read on the screen there. They were very, very kind about their mentors' intentions. And it wasn't the case that they felt like the students at Nottingham didn't care about them, but it was very critical of how the mentoring scheme had been set up. And in fact, this comment in green here really struck home with me, because I thought, this is actually the opposite of what we were trying to achieve by instigating this scheme to start with. And so on the back of receiving this feedback, we had even a bit of a light bulb moment, which was reiterated in some of the comments. So the comment in blue here basically says it all, really. It would have been quite useful if we had just had some other forms of contact rather than email and got to know our mentors. So armed with this information, we were determined to make changes for next year, but then lockdown happened. So myself and the other senior tutors at Nottingham got our heads together, and we thought, right, well, the mentoring scheme has kind of fallen by the wayside for this year. As it happens, in case you're concerned for our students, the feedback on their general support and well-being was very, very strong. So I think we've plugged those gaps elsewhere. But what we decided to do at that point was make a concerted effort to provide effective virtual support through our personal tutoring system. So up until that point, our personal tutoring system, like many, had revolved around meetings, one-to-one meetings with the tutor. Hodgson, those happen every sort of 6 weeks, and they follow a sort of standard reflective portfolio action planning type cycle, which is mandated by the GMC, and it mirrors what a doctor would have to do in terms of their professional validation throughout their career. So we took this system and we sort of overnight decided that all tutors have to make Teams groups. We switched from this schedule of 6 weekly one-to-one meetings to having weekly video calls or interactions. And we sort of made use of other informal means of support. So lockdown happened at the end of March. Our students were facing their first summative exams in the beginning of May. So the last few weeks of teaching had gone online, and it was, their anxiety was high, as I think a lot of you can probably identify with your students. In medicine, if you're not familiar with medical students, anxiety is high anyway. You're dealing with a group of students who are highly capable, but who are very perfectionist and put themselves under a lot of pressure, even from the first year. So that, coupled with the stress of the pandemic, the fact that their visits stopped, their clinical skills sessions where they practice the skills that they're examined on stopped, their anatomy labs stopped where they actually get to see the specimens up close, and they felt overwhelmed with pressure that they still had these exams to pass. So by adapting our personal tutor system, make it go virtual, we were hoping to alleviate some of these concerns. We were also a little bit sceptical based on our peer mentoring experience, but we felt that if, we've learned from that, we could try and make a concerted effort. Did it work? Well, thankfully, yes, it did. the feedback that we received about personal tutoring all year actually was positive, but it was overwhelmingly positive about what happened after lockdown. And I think, having spoken to other senior tutors I know nationally, and seen different anecdotes in the media and on social media, I think this may go against what other students experienced from their universities during lockdown. Our students reported actually feeling less concerned, so reducing anxiety, and felt more connected to the school than they had done before, which is an odd sense, but I think, it's because we were making these efforts to all get together within the tutor groups and meet when everybody was at home and not doing anything else. We also saw an increase in interaction of students who were previously hard to reach. So if you are a personal tutor or have any involvement in student support, you'll know that there's always a few students each year who just don't come to meetings, say they're fine, you don't really know them, it's difficult to really say if they're a student that's doing well or got issues. So you get those in medicine too, it's not any different. But we saw that tutors who had students like that were actually saying, so-and-so is now interacting with me, they're really happy to just have a chat on Teams or whatever. So there were some unexpected positives. Also, for our students who are highly anxious for when coming into university would ordinarily be quite a stretch, the environment of actually having support in their own home was positive as well. So again, students with mental health concerns were reported feeling more supported. Now, this is anecdotal. We haven't published this. This has just come from our personal tutoring feedback survey. But nevertheless, we think it was a really positive scheme. So I just want to spend the next few minutes just talking about some top tips for successful virtual support. So I've sort of whizzed through our journey, but we've learned some key things here, and this is not rocket science, and I'm absolutely sure that you can find this information elsewhere. And in fact, this presentation is sort of born out of Chris's very informative Twitter thread about providing successful pastoral support. But first of all, we found that when we used video calls rather than just audio or like a telephone, it was much easier to build a rapport and a relationship with someone. Now, there is actually evidence behind this. I'm a psychologist by background, so we know quite a lot about face-to-face interaction. But it definitely facilitated those conversations if you can see the other person. Now, this has to come with some caveats. The success of using video calls is going to be environment dependent, is how I thought best to phrase it, and that means yours as well as theirs. So there's perhaps a tendency to think that now we're all quite used to doing virtual meetings, that we don't really have to behave in the same way in terms of our body language and our non-verbal communication as if we would in a room full of people. The sort of virtual eye rolling moment, you probably do more than you would if you were actually sitting across the room from somebody saying something you didn't really agree with. So as a provider of support, it's really important that your environment is appropriate and is equipping the student to actually share with you. And so it means the obvious things like getting rid of distractions, making sure you're not interrupted, actually paying attention, not fiddling with your email at the same time. But also being aware that the student's end of the call might not be an environment that they want to have the camera on. We know certainly some of our students have gone back into very busy households. They probably don't have any time alone, so a call wouldn't be private, or they might have other people in the room with them. So it's really important just to be aware of the environment. But if you can have some control over that, then using video is very beneficial. So the second top tip is about making use of a variety of methods. And I think this is where we went wrong really with our virtual peer mentoring scheme, because we got the students to rely on email, which works in the standard mentoring scheme because email is a sort of route into an appointment or an arrangement to meet up. And then that meeting happens and the relationship builds from that meeting. But when the email is the only interaction, it becomes rather formulaic and doesn't lead to relationship building. We found that the chat function, so we use Teams because that's what both universities that we are involved with use. But I think, all software have these kind of instant messaging functions. We found that these worked really well with our students. And it was you're much more likely to get a reply. Well, certainly some of my tutees, you're much more likely to get a reply by just putting a message in the chat than writing an email, for example, and asking how someone is. It was also important to recognise, this is some of the feedback from our tutors that was really interesting, is that each student will have a different preference for how they want to be contacted. So it's important to know your tutees, and this is where the benefit of having had a relationship that was built from a face-to-face setting initially was really useful. We also learnt that it's important to mix it up a little bit, so not just having one-to-one meetings. During lockdown, this was especially interesting as we got towards the end of May, and we'd been doing this for sort of 2 months. I certainly remember a conversation with one of my tutees who was, who's very conscientious and very diligent, but after 2 months of neither of us having really been out of the house, it was a bit sort of like tumbleweeds, sort of very, and he said at one point, "You're very happy to chat, but I actually haven't done anything since I last spoke to you." So having group tutorials gets them talking to each other, and as a tutor you don't really sort of need to facilitate the conversation, and that's where I would say don't be afraid to make them non-academic. So there's some where we just played games, or I've got a pitch there of the sort of word games or virtual treasure hunts that Chris has great ideas about, posting GIFs about how you're feeling. I've used that one. They are really good at connecting people and making them feel that you've got shared interests and that you're going through similar experiences without having to necessarily have a deep and meaningful conversation about what you're feeling right now and sharing with a group of people you might not want to. It was also really important for us to realise that probably a large factor of success during lockdown was the fact that we increased our scheduled contact points. So, and I think this is the thing that this is the point that we're now taking forward in our personal tutoring and peer mentoring schemes that are just starting again this week. Yesterday, our students came back for this year. And we realised that virtual interaction, because it reduces the opportunity for a lot of non-verbal cueing that you use when you're communicating, it actually takes a lot longer to develop a rapport with somebody, and that then has a knock-on effect to how quickly you would trust them. So essentially, the relationship building process slows down. So we're trying to sort of artificially speed that back up by increasing the amount of contact that we have. So what we're doing this year with the peer mentoring program, which is sort of semi-virtual because the students are allowed to meet if they make those arrangements, but obviously not all of them will want to, even though they're now in the same city, because we've now got second years and first years. Because of COVID, they might not want to mix with somebody they don't necessarily live with. What we're asking our mentors to do is have Teams groups or WhatsApp chat, whatever they choose, and to every other week, if they haven't already organised an opportunity, occasion for them to get together, to make a concerted effort to do that. We've also removed the contact points from around exams, so our students are formatively assessed every 6 weeks. And whilst that's a useful trigger point for asking whether someone needs support, it actually probably makes it a little bit structured or sort of, it sticks too much to the academic content and doesn't really allow the opportunity for the mentees to say that they might be struggling with another aspect. So we've sort of peeled it back from that structure. And in terms of personal tutoring, again, we've increased the scheduled contact points. Now, I appreciate that this is workload. This has workload implications. And as senior tutor, I've had conversations with our tutors about this. But that's where I would probably push back slightly and say, but virtual interaction makes that easier. So absolutely, if you've got 20 tutees, like I have this year, having a one-to-one meeting with all of them face-to-face is going to be a lot of time, especially if we start, changing that from every 6 weeks to every 3 weeks. But turning to an online forum, switching a one-to-one to a group tutorial, that sort of thing, actually can kind of quite seamlessly drop into the timetable. And then lastly, I just want to finish this point, which sort of is slightly separate to providing just online support, but it was an important point that came up recently when I had a very difficult conversation with a student, and that actually, if we can still meet face-to-face currently at Lincoln, there are lots of parameters we have to meet and things we have to follow, but it is still possible to be on campus with your tutee. I knew that what this student was going to have to tell me was going to be quite difficult. So I think it was really important that we made sure all of the stuff about COVID and, routes into the building and where someone has to sit and whether you have to wear a mask was kind of all organised before the meeting happened, so that when we got there, she was able to say what she needed to say, and it was still hopefully a useful meeting for her. So I think it's important to realise that some things are still easy to say face to face, and if you can facilitate that in a socially distanced way, it's really good to get those boundaries, if you like, set out, rather than standing there at the beginning of the meeting talking about stuff in a kind of business-like way, which removes the rapport and trust building that hopefully you've built up. So that's all I've got to say, and I'm happy to take any questions. I just want to thank Professor Pam Hagan and Dr. Yvonne Mabaki and Deborah Merrick, who are the senior tutor team at Nottingham, who have helped troubleshoot, and we put our heads together to try and make this work for our 200 students and Nottingham's 1,500 undergraduate students. So